Welcome to Dr. Amanda Clarke, Heart Health and Cardiology. Today, we are talking about what actually happens to your heart when you stop eating sugar for 30 days, and why the research on this may be the most important thing you read this year. Let us get into it. I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about what you ate yesterday, not the full nutritious meal you sat down for. All of it, the coffee with 2 sugars in the morning, the yogurt that said low fat on the label, the granola bar you grabbed on the way out the door, the salad dressing at lunch, the ketchup with dinner, the handful of crackers you ate while watching television, the glass of juice that seemed like the healthy choice. Now, here is what most people do not know about that list. Every single item on it contained added sugar. Some of them contained a surprising amount. The low-fat yogurt contained more sugar than a chocolate chip cookie. The granola bar had nearly as much added sugar as a candy bar. And by the end of a perfectly normal day of eating what felt like reasonable food, you had consumed somewhere between 15 and 17 teaspoons of added sugar. That is according to the American Heart Association's research on average American consumption, 15 to 17 teaspoons every single day. And your heart, your arteries, your liver, your pancreas, and your blood vessels are absorbing every gram of it. Today I want to walk you through something that the research makes extraordinarily clear, but that almost no one explains in terms that connect directly to the person sitting at home, wondering whether changing their diet would actually make a real difference to their cardiovascular health. I want to walk you through exactly what happens to your heart and your cardiovascular system when you remove that sugar from your diet for 30 days. Not what you might feel. In general terms, not vague assurances about health improvements. The specific biological processes, the specific markers that change, the specific mechanisms by which your heart and arteries begin to recover when the constant flood of added sugar is removed. Because the research on this is remarkable, and most people never hear it explained with this level of clarity and this level of honesty about both what is proven and what still needs more study. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly what added sugar does to your cardiovascular system over time. What happens inside your body in the first 3 days of removing it? What the research shows about changes in week 1 and week 2? What the full 30-day picture looks like for your heart health? What the most important piece of research published this year says about sugar and cardiovascular outcomes across a lifetime? And what a realistic, practical approach to reducing added sugar looks like for someone with a real life and real habits. Stay with us because the final section of this video contains the single most actionable piece of information in this entire discussion, and it is the part that turns understanding into actual change. Let us start with what added sugar actually does to the cardiovascular system, because the damage pathway is more direct and more specific than most people realize. When you consume added sugar, your blood glucose levels rise rapidly. Your pancreas responds by releasing insulin, the hormone that signals your cells to absorb that glucose from the bloodstream. In a healthy metabolic state, that system works efficiently. The glucose is absorbed. Insulin levels return to baseline, and the process is complete. But when added sugar consumption is chronically elevated, when your pancreas is producing insulin spikes multiple times every day, in response to repeated sugar loads, several things begin to happen that directly affect your heart and your arteries. The first is a process called insulin resistance. When your cells are exposed to chronically elevated insulin signals, they gradually become less sensitive to those signals. They require more insulin to produce the same glucose uptake response. Your pancreas responds by producing even more insulin, and the resulting chronically elevated insulin levels in your bloodstream trigger a cascade of effects throughout your cardiovascular system. Elevated insulin stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, which raises blood pressure. It promotes the retention of sodium in the kidneys, which also raises blood pressure. It promotes the production of triglycerides, a type of fat in the blood that is directly associated with increased cardiovascular risk, and it contributes to the inflammatory environment in the blood vessels that promotes the development of atherosclerosis, the buildup of plaque inside the arterial walls that is the underlying cause of most heart attacks and strokes. The second direct cardiovascular effect of chronically high added sugar consumption involves the liver. When you consume more sugar than your cells can immediately use for energy, the liver converts the excess into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. That fat is released back into the bloodstream as very low-density lipoprotein particles, which deliver it to fat storage sites throughout the body. But some of that fat also accumulates in the liver itself, a condition called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease that is now recognized as a significant independent cardiovascular risk factor. The liver fat disrupts the normal processing of cholesterol and triglycerides in ways that worsen the lipid profile in your blood and increase the risk of cardiovascular events beyond what the elevated triglycerides alone would predict. And the third mechanism is inflammation. Added sugar, particularly fructose, which is one of the two components of table sugar and the primary sweetener in high fructose corn syrup, drives the production of inflammatory compounds in the body through multiple pathways. Chronic low-grade inflammation in the blood vessel walls is now understood to be a central mechanism in the development of atherosclerosis. The inflammatory cells that accumulate in arterial walls in response to this chronic inflammatory environment are a key part of the process by which plaque forms and grows. And chronically high added sugar consumption is one of the dietary patterns most consistently associated with elevated markers of systemic inflammation in the research literature. Now here is what most people never find out. The average American adult consumes 17 teaspoons of added sugar every single day. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 9 teaspoons per Dalton Y for men and 6 teaspoons per Dalton Y for women. That means the average American man is consuming nearly double the recommended amount, and the average American woman is consuming nearly triple the recommended amount every single day. Not occasionally, not on special occasions, as a routine feature of a normal American diet. And the foods delivering that excess sugar are largely invisible as sugar sources to the people consuming them. Bread, pasta sauce, flavored yogurt, sports drinks, vitamin waters, breakfast cereals including ones marketed as healthy granola, energy bars, salad dressings, condiments. The added sugar in the American food supply is so pervasive that it is almost impossible to avoid without making a deliberate and informed effort to do so. Let me tell you about Jennifer. She was 47 years old, an accountant from Colorado, who would have told you she did not eat much sugar. She did not drink soda. She rarely ate candy. She avoided desserts most of the time. She thought of herself as someone who was reasonably careful about her diet. When she actually sat down and read the labels on everything she ate for 3 days, she was genuinely shocked. The flavored oatmeal she had for breakfast every morning had 22 grams of added sugar per serving. The salad dressing she used at lunch had 8 grams per 2 tablespoon serving, and she typically used more than 2 tablespoons. The protein bar she ate as an afternoon snack had 17 grams of added sugar. The pasta sauce she used for dinner had 12 grams per half cup. By the time she added it all up, Jennifer was consuming close to 70 grams of added sugar every day, nearly 15 teaspoons, and she had absolutely no idea, because none of those foods had ever seemed like sugar foods to her. They had seemed like reasonable, moderately healthy choices for a busy working adult. Jennifer's experience is not unusual. It is one of the most common discoveries people make when they actually begin paying attention to where their added sugar is coming from, and understanding it is the essential first step to understanding why removing added sugar produces the cardiovascular changes that the research documents. Now let us talk about what actually happens inside your body when you make that change. And this is where the timeline becomes genuinely fascinating and genuinely encouraging. In the first 3 days after removing added sugar from your diet, your blood sugar levels begin to stabilize. Instead of the repeated spikes and crashes that follow each sugar intake, your blood glucose moves in a steadier pattern. Your insulin levels, freed from the obligation to respond to repeated sugar loads throughout the day, begin to come down. Most people find this period the most challenging part of the entire 30 days. The adjustment is real. Headaches are common in the first 1 to 3 days as the brain adapts to steadier glucose levels after a period of relying on frequent sugar hits. Irritability is common. Fatigue is common. Intense cravings for sugar or simple carbohydrates are common and typically peak within the first week. These symptoms are uncomfortable, but they are temporary, and they are a sign that something real is happening metabolically. Your body is adjusting to a fundamentally different fuel supply pattern, and the transition has a cost that is measured in days, not weeks. But here is something your doctor may not have had time to explain. Those craving symptoms are not a sign that you need sugar. They are a sign that your brain's reward pathways, which have been repeatedly stimulated by sugar intake in ways that some researchers compare to the patterns of other reward-producing substances, are adjusting to the absence of that stimulation. The cravings are the adjustment. They peak, and then they diminish. By the end of the first week, for most people, the intensity of the cravings has reduced significantly. And the energy crashes, the 3 in the afternoon slump that so many people associate with normal daily energy patterns, begin to level out as blood sugar stabilizes into a more consistent pattern. In week 1 to 2, something more significant begins to happen at the metabolic level. Without the constant influx of added sugar, your insulin levels drop further, and your insulin sensitivity begins to improve. Your cells are becoming more responsive to insulin again, because they are no longer being bombarded with repeated high insulin signals. That improvement in insulin sensitivity has direct cardiovascular consequences. Lower insulin levels reduce the sympathetic nervous system stimulation that raises blood pressure. Lower insulin levels reduce sodium retention in the kidneys. Lower insulin levels reduce the production of very low-density lipoprotein particles that carry fat in the bloodstream, and every one of those changes moves your cardiovascular risk profile in a healthier direction. Research published by the American Heart Association showed that reducing added sugar intake produces measurable improvements in triglyceride levels, in LDL cholesterol patterns, and in blood pressure, within the time frame of a few weeks of consistent reduction. These are not marginal changes. Triglycerides are a cardiovascular risk factor that responds remarkably quickly to changes in sugar intake. Some research has shown triglyceride reductions of 20 to 30% within weeks of significantly reducing added sugar consumption in people with initially elevated levels, 20 to 30%, from a single dietary change, without medication, without dramatic alterations to anything else in the diet, just the removal of added sugar. And this is where it gets really serious. Because what is happening to triglycerides and insulin and inflammation markers in weeks 1 and 2 is just the beginning. In week 3 and week 4, the cumulative effects of those metabolic changes begin to compound. The reduction in chronic inflammation that accompanies lower sugar intake does not produce immediate visible results in the way that blood glucose changes do. It is a slower process, but by week 3, the research shows measurable reductions in inflammatory markers in the blood of people who have consistently eliminated added sugar. And the reduction in inflammatory load in the blood vessels is exactly the kind of change that, sustained over time, reduces the pace of atherosclerotic plaque development in the arterial walls. Your blood pressure, if it has been running elevated partly due to the insulin-related mechanisms we discussed, typically shows meaningful improvement by the end of 4 weeks of reduced sugar intake in people for whom those mechanisms were contributing to the elevation. Your liver, freed from the obligation to process the daily excess of fructose into fat through de novo lipogenesis, begins to reduce its fat content. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is not reversed in 30 days, but the accumulation of new liver fat stops, and the liver's function in processing cholesterol and triglycerides begins to normalize as the fat burden decreases. Now here is something that should genuinely concern every American parent watching this video. A landmark study published in one of the world's most prestigious medical journals earlier this year provided some of the most compelling evidence yet about the relationship between early life sugar consumption and adult cardiovascular health. The study used a remarkable natural experiment from history. When sugar rationing in the United Kingdom ended in 1953, there was an immediate and dramatic increase in sugar consumption among people who had grown up with restricted sugar access. Researchers were able to compare the lifetime cardiovascular outcomes of people born just before the end of rationing who experienced restricted sugar in their earliest years of life with those born just after who grew up with unrestricted access. The findings were striking. The people whose early life included lower sugar consumption were significantly less likely to develop heart attack, heart failure, and stroke as adults. The protective effects were largest for people whose sugar was restricted from conception through approximately the first 1,000 days of life. The research suggested that the cardiovascular habits and metabolic patterns established in the earliest years of life have consequences that echo across decades into adult health outcomes. Think about what that means for the food choices being made in American households right now. not just for the adults who are watching this video and whose cardiovascular health reflects years of dietary habits, but for the children growing up in those households who are developing metabolic patterns and cardiovascular risk profiles that will shape their health outcomes decades from now. The juice boxes, the sweetened cereals, the flavored yogurt pouches, the snack bars marketed specifically at children, all of these are establishing patterns of high sugar intake in the years when metabolic patterns are most plastic and most consequential for long-term health. But here is the thing that changes everything about this discussion. Reducing added sugar does not mean giving up the foods you love. It does not mean never having something sweet again. It does not mean a life of restriction and deprivation that is more miserable than the cardiovascular risk it is trying to reduce. It means becoming informed about where the added sugar in your diet is actually coming from. It means reading labels. It means discovering that the biggest sources of added sugar in the average American diet are not the desserts and the candy that most people think of as sugar foods. They are the everyday staples that carry invisible sugar loads: bread, pasta sauce, condiments, flavored beverages including juice and sports drinks, breakfast foods, snack bars. Once you know where it is coming from, you can make specific targeted reductions in those areas while keeping the foods you actually enjoy. Let me tell you about what happened to Jennifer 30 days after she decided to actually read the labels on everything she ate. She switched her morning oatmeal to plain oats with fresh berries. She switched her salad dressing to olive oil and lemon. She stopped buying flavored protein bars and started eating nuts. She switched her pasta sauce to a brand that had no added sugar. She did not go on a diet. She did not count calories. She did not give up any food group. She just stopped buying the foods that were delivering invisible sugar loads she had not known were there. At her doctor's appointment 6 weeks later, her triglycerides had come down by 28%. Her fasting blood glucose had dropped meaningfully out of the borderline range it had been creeping toward. Her blood pressure, which had been slightly elevated for 2 years without reaching the hypertensive threshold, was comfortably in the normal range for the first time since her mid-40s. Her doctor looked at those numbers and asked her what she had changed. Jennifer said she had started reading labels. That is not a dramatic story. It is not a medical miracle. It is what happens when ordinary information about what is actually an ordinary food is connected to ordinary motivated people who want to protect their health. The knowledge is the intervention. The change in behavior follows naturally when the knowledge is clear. So what is the most practical thing you can do starting today based on everything we have covered in this video? Do not try to eliminate all added sugar from your diet immediately. For most people, that approach leads to the overwhelming withdrawal symptoms we described and eventually to abandoning the effort entirely. Instead, start with the biggest sources of invisible added sugar in your diet. Spend 1 week reading the nutrition labels on everything you currently buy and eat. Look specifically for the line that says added sugars. The Food and Drug Administration now requires that number to be listed separately from naturally occurring sugars on nutrition labels. Find your biggest sources and start there, just there. Replace the highest added sugar items with lower sugar alternatives, one at a time. Give your palate time to adjust. Give your metabolism time to respond, and then take stock at 30 days of how you feel, how your energy patterns have changed, and if you have access to blood work, what has happened to your triglycerides, your fasting blood glucose, and your blood pressure. The research is clear, the mechanism is understood, the benefits are documented, and the change required to access those benefits is not as dramatic or as difficult as most people assume before they actually make it. Your heart is asking for less sugar. The question is whether you are ready to listen. If this video gave you a genuinely clearer and more complete picture of what added sugar actually does to your cardiovascular system, what the research shows about what 30 days of reduction produces, and what a practical, realistic approach to making that change actually looks like, subscribe to Dr. Amanda Clarke and turn on notifications so you never miss a video that matters for your health. And drop a comment below answering this question honestly. What is the single biggest source of added sugar in your daily diet that you did not realize was a sugar food until watching this video? Every comment matters, and your honest answers help us understand what this community needs most.